This is Discelony. Welcome to episode 21 of 90s Overlooked Underheard. Hi, so over the last few episodes we've dealt with some kind of pretty dark, quite complex, quite exhausting records. So being as we're sticking to our chronology, this time the chronology seems to have kind of intervened and given us a couple of lighter, sunnier listens. And both the records today are interesting in that they are both released on the Flying Nun label, which is one of the most interesting kind of independent labels of the 1980s and 90s. So yeah, Flying Nun was an indie label which began in Christchurch in New Zealand at the beginning of the 1980s. Record FN001, the first release on Flying Nun, was a single by a band called the Pink Group in late, I believe, 1981. So it was the label's second release that really put them on the map, and that was the Clean's debut single, Tally Ho. Yeah, this kind of broke out in New Zealand and went top 20, I believe. So yeah, it was a big hit. It put the label kind of squarely in people's focus and provided them with some much needed cash. And this was really just the beginning for Flying Nun. They went on to release a string of superb, important kind of records from the Indian alternative scene in New Zealand. The Flying Nun kind of stable was characterized initially, at least, by what was described as the Dunedin sound. Dunedin being kind of a large university town, quite distant from Christchurch, but on the South Island of New Zealand. A big student population, yeah, and just distant enough so that it could kind of develop its own thing. So the Dunedin sound kind of sprung from that kind of aesthetic of, you know, the UK kind of punk sound of the late 70s, but it kind of tended to lean in more heavily to the influences of that scene itself. So big on bands like the Stooges and the Velvet Underground, but also a very kind of high pop element, very artful kind of links to kind of psychedelic pop like the Beatles and the Byrds and Syd Barrett era kind of Pink Floyd. But it was kind of also characterized by this kind of quite loose DIY kind of ramshackle kind of sound, which was initially down, I think, at least to the kind of resources they had available to them for recording bands down there in New Zealand. It was quite difficult to get equipment there. So, I mean, some key bands of this period would be, as I mentioned, the Clean. Initially very short-lived. They had a very short run from around about 1978 to 82 when they broke up. They would reform countless times over the years. But, yes, they define this kind of, they're the classic Dunedin band. Poppy kind of, this kind of almost magical simplicity at the heart of everything. Just kind of a repetitive kind of rattly sound with these kind of bright, surfy, trebly, psychedelic guitar tones. Yeah, a really unique sound. The Chills were another big band of this period, primarily a vehicle for the singer-songwriter Martin Phillips, who basically is the core of the Chills and has been even to this very day. Yeah, this is kind of the archetypal shambly indie pop sound, but I think a large part of it was hatched in New Zealand by Martin Phillips. And thirdly, I think you'd probably put the Verlaines, much more kind of knotty and complex sounding band, all focused around the songwriting of Graham Downes. Yeah, supremely poppy and kind of pretty songs, but really dizzying kind of structures going on within some of it. Graham was a student of kind of classical music, and he brought a lot of that to his music. Yeah, it can't really be understated how influential this kind of small label from New Zealand and the bands that initially came in were to the kind of what we now think of as the indie sound across the world. I think it's quite okay to put Flying Nun in the same kind of bracket as labels like Factory or Rough Trade, or some of the American labels like Sub Pop, Shimmy Disc, K. Yeah, a very, very influential label who over the years, throughout the 80s and into the 90s, made releases from numerous other bands, names like Tall Dwarfs, The Gordons, Belter Space, Straitjacket Fits, Snapper. Yeah, these kind of just kept coming. And as the label got bigger and released more, they even started picking up a few kind of non-New Zealand artists for album releases, occasional one-off album releases. So yeah, within New Zealand, there were one or two Fall albums or a Sonic Youth album or two that got released via Flying Nun. But getting as big as they did, ultimately they ended up opening kind of a distribution and a recording office in Europe, in London, in fact, in the early 90s. And yeah, this kind of led to a bit of an expansion of what the label was releasing. They still focused on New Zealand artists, New Zealand underground indie alternative artists, but they were also kind of picking up and distributing odd artists from different parts of the world, from America, and putting them out in Europe. And it's obviously, being where we are in the timeline, this is the kind of period I'm going to be looking at with the two albums I'm going to talk about today. So today's first album is Sugarmouth by David Kilgour, released sometime in 1994. So David Kilgour is in fact the guitarist and one of the main singer-songwriters from The Clean. So yeah, between kind of periods when he wasn't playing with The Clean, David released several things as part of different side projects throughout the 1980s. Kind of things like The Great Unwashed, which was him and his brother Hamish together, and kind of a one-off EP by a band called Stephen. But it was during the 90s that David really kind of started to focus on solo records, using either just his own name or often, you know, using an and with his backing band. This backing band did develop over time to become known as the Heavy Eights. So Sugarmouth is David's second official solo album, following 1991's Here Come the Cars LP, which is also fantastic. But Sugarmouth, yeah, it's this beautiful, sunny, dreamy, kind of bristling pop record. You hear David's signature guitar sound in spades on this album. It's kind of delicately kind of clangy, but chimey and very present. But that presence is never kind of a piercing brightness. It's always just very there. And yeah, his style is just this kind of tumbling, spinning, jangling delight. So yeah, Sugarmouth is a very kind of breezy sounding album. And I think it's the kind of thing which you really need to take in a single, like, sitting. It's kind of very sticky and moorish. It's like a really good dessert. But despite that, I will try and just cover some key tracks. Fall Away is a kind of a slightly folky, shimmery, kind of kaleidoscopic little guitar riff, which just propels the song, but never kind of shies away. This riff just stays there. It's kind of glistening on the surface all the time, like sunlight on water, with this kind of little acoustic thing underpinning it. It's got these dreamy kind of distracted lyrics, just beautifully delivered. But there's hints of something darker happening at a distance within the song. David sings, "As soon as I get you up close, I just push you away and fall away." But it never kind of loses this kind of joyous, kind of carefree thing at the heart of the song. It's just wonderful, wonderful pop music. Crazy has got this kind of chugging. It's like nearly a noise pop kind of guitar buzz. And it's just got the simplest of like bass lines underneath, which kind of has this kind of shift, which just changes the feel of the song to devastating effect. As I say, it's very, very simple music. But there's also this kind of buried REM-like kind of jangle, which pokes out through this kind of buzzing guitar feel of this track. Yeah, it's kind of addictively repetitive and kind of sweet, unfussy, kind of wistful feeling. The track Never End is this kind of very simple, crystalline kind of acoustic folk ending to the record. It's got just these two exquisite kind of little acoustic guitar lines going on at the same time. One just strumming and the other one picking at this kind of bell-like little melody. David sings, "Summer has faded, all colour has faded. Was It Ever With Us? Yeah, the song has this kind of cyclical structure. It feels like it could just go on forever and ever. It's just, you know, this kind of captured moment that you just kind of want to keep reliving. Hence the title, I guess, Never End. But yeah, it's really hard to put your finger on what it is about David Kilgour. There's just something magical about the way he goes about writing and recording and performing music. He seems to double down on really simple structures, really simple ideas with relish, but still kind of tease out all this kind of mystery and sunshine out of them. Yeah, it's kind of that feeling of like a half remembered memory that just puts a smile on your face, and brightens something that would otherwise be really boring. He's a very, very talented songwriter. Kind of unflappable, completely anchored, knows exactly what he's doing. And on this record, he just does it so, so well. So our second album today is Interstate by Pell Mell, released towards the end of April of 1995. So we've made it halfway through the decade. So this is one of those non-New Zealand bands. Yeah, Pell Mell were seemingly around for quite a long time without ever actually releasing a lot, or certainly releasing a lot that you could get hold of easily. They formed in 1980 in Portland, Oregon, and kind of over their first kind of few years pushed out an EP or two and a lot of kind of self-produced cassette releases. And it wasn't until kind of a little later in the decade, about 1987, that they actually recorded their debut proper album, which was on the SST label and was called The Bumper Crop. And they followed that up shortly afterwards, kind of in about 1991, I believe, with the Flow album. During this period, there were constant lineup changes in the band, but the one ever-present member was Bob Bierman, who drummed with Pell Mell right from their original lineup right to their final releases. So I think the kind of sporadic, kind of stop-start nature of Pell Mell's kind of career during this period is largely down to what lineup changes and what some of that lineup were actually doing. So by the time of Interstate, the lineup had crystallized around Steve Fisk on keys, Greg Freeman on bass, and Dave Spaulding on guitar, with Bob ever present on drums. And by this point, Steve Fisk had become a producer and an engineer of quite some repute. Yeah, he'd worked on lots of quite big records by artists like Nirvana and Low, Soundgarden, The Wedding Present. He was much in demand, so I think his time was quite precious, and possibly Pell Mell didn't get to see him as much as they would have liked. The most important thing about Pell Mell's sound is that they are almost entirely instrumental. And I think that gave them a kind of a bit of a boost around about this time, around about 95, because this was the point where you were seeing a lot of the post-rock bands emerging. But Pell Mell weren't post-rock. They didn't have that kind of textural, jazzy, modern, classical, electronic side to their sound. They were far more rooted in, you know, a much more classic kind of earlier strand of instrumental rock. Think of kind of the atmospheric kind of stuff by guitarists like, you know, Link Wray and Duane Eddy, or that kind of splashy, bouncy surf rock sound of, you know, bands like, you know, the Ventures or the Chantays, or even UK's The Shadows. There's also kind of hints of that very early kind of electronic keyboard organ kind of thing that you would get going on. I'm thinking here of specific tracks, something like Telstar, the very kind of early novelty kind of hit by Joe Meek. And I think there's an awful lot of kind of movie soundtrack influences here. You know, classic 60s, 70s movie soundtrack icons like Ennio Morricone and Lalo Schifrin. it's definitely a feeling of kind of soundscapes in a lot of the tracks here, you know, as if they were kind of soundtracking imaginary movies. Barry Adamson, ex of Magazine and the Bad Seeds, was doing something very similar, but he was specifically kind of conjuring up the idea of a whole movie in his mind and then soundtracking it. I don't think there's ever a kind of an overarching theme to Pell Mell's music, and certainly to Interstate. Yeah, the tracks conjure up images. They conjure up kind of filmic soundtrack style imagery, but they are all disconnected and can be taken as kind of separate songs. Yeah, so some key tracks. The opener, Nothing Lies Still Long, it is an odd one in that it kind of almost immediately developed a second life, as it was picked up by the creators of the TV show 6 Feet Under, for use as the kind of the regular recap, you know, the next week on 6 Feet Under music. So yeah, it was everywhere for a short period. But despite that, yeah, as a piece of music in its own right, it's a kind of a moody, prowling, it's got this kind of reverberant kind of a spy movie style guitar, which is stalking this really menacing kind of bass line. It's got a very cool kind of mysterious sound to it. I can see why it would have been picked up for use the way it was. And it builds and builds to this kind of repetitive, clean, kind of slightly more piercing guitar riff towards the song's close. It's a very cool piece of music. Yeah, it also kind of clips along on almost a krautrock kind of beat with this bouncy driving bass line. It's got these kind of curt, kind of choppy little guitar strums punctuating it until somewhere near the middle, this dirty kind of soaring, almost Stereolab style keyboard kind of works its way in, pushing kind of the needle into the red, pushing it higher. Yeah, it's cool. It's kind of edgy. It feels propulsive. It's a good song. Similarly, Blacktop, the track rides a very kind of similar beat and tempo as Saucer, but it just kind of ups the ante even more. This kind of motoric krautrock style beat takes the song so far, and then for the first time you hear a distorted, garbled, kind of agitated voice breaking through. You can't figure out what on earth it's saying, but it kind of pushes the song over the edge into this kind of full-on organ kind of fueled kind of strumming fury. Again, this one leans even heavier on a kind of Stereolab sound, I think, but it's brasher, harsher. It's very direct. Yeah, another really good song. So I think the closing kind of run of the album, the last 3 or 4 songs, edges it closer to maybe some of the more abstract post-rock kind of moods, but maybe not the sounds. You know, the instrumentation always grounds it in this kind of feel of soundtrack music, instrumental rock. There's this kind of feel that they're using kind of the pop culture tropes and tones and iconography to kind of shape the moods of the songs. So something like Drift, it begins kind of quite querulously, with a kind of an odd feel, like almost like a kind of a prototype kind of Mogwai song. But as it progresses, the more these kind of influences of Pell Mell seep back in, until by the end you get a big kind of John Barry, James Bond themed kind of tremoloed guitar cutting into it. And yeah, the track Vegetable Kingdom, it marries this kind of growling kind of Hammond organ and mellotron sounds to this kind of precise, kind of slightly clipped riffing, but it does kind of stretch out into this kind of hazier, spacier territory as it kind of passes the halfway point. So I think if you're the kind of listener that feels like you need a voice in there to kind of center the music for you, then I don't think Interstate will be for you. But I think if you like music that has kind of a story to try and tell, that leans into these kind of textures using imagery and sounds from the past, from movies, from cool music from the past, and injects everything with this kind of cool, open, widescreen sense of space, sense of travel, this drama, then yeah, you love Interstate. So yeah, there you have it. A bit of change of pace and tone, I think, with today's episode. I'm hoping you enjoyed it. In fact, I'm hoping you enjoyed it enough that you might want to do one of those things down there. If you don't, that's fine. But it would really be very nice if you would come back and join me very soon for another episode of 90s Overlooked Underheard. Bye for now.